Watch this.
Just days after former state representative Aaron Von Ellinger was convicted of rape, Jane Doe's attorney is sharing what she says needs to change in order to help victims feel comfortable coming forward. 173 men went to work at the Sunshine Mine in Kellogg 50 years ago today. 91 never made it home, forever changing the lives of their families and the industry. You know, summer really is the best time to take in a movie under the stars. But this summer, stars will be all you'll be able to see in Driggs after the damage to their historic movie screen. I'd like to tell you the nightmare Jane Doe has been living this past year ended last week with the rape conviction of former Representative Aaron Von Ellinger. I'd like to tell you it ended, but unfortunately, for sexual assault survivors, it doesn't work that way. This is a trauma that will likely take many more years to come to terms for Jane Doe. The 19-year-old intern Von Ellinger raped in his apartment on March 9th of 2021. That night, they went to dinner, then back to his apartment, where he sat on top of her and forced himself upon her. She reported the assault 2 days later, March 11th, to the House of Representatives Sergeant-at-Arms and the Boise Police Department. That was followed by weeks of private meetings and interviews at the State House. And then on April 16th, after the accusation became public, in an attempt to defend Von Ellinger, Representative Priscilla Giddings doxed Jane Doe by reposting a blog post on her Facebook page that included the victim's real name and picture. The end of that month saw a House ethics hearing into Von Ellinger's behavior in which he was censured, I should say, and he resigned to avoid a vote to expel from his colleagues. In that hearing, Jane Doe was forced to testify. It didn't go well, and it didn't end well. There was also an ethics hearing into Representative Giddings' actions, where she was also censured and stripped of a committee assignment. But that wasn't the end of it. Von Ellinger was arrested on September 25th in Georgia and brought back to Boise to face charges of rape and forcible penetration. Meanwhile, the harassment of Jane Doe continued, with supporters of Von Ellinger dressing up as her at an Idaho Republican winter meeting. Then came the trial, where Jane Doe was asked to relive and retell the evening of March 9th, 2021. And she couldn't do it. She walked off the stand. Well, today we spoke with Jane Doe's attorney, Annie Hightower. Hightower has worked with Jane Doe since the ethics hearing back in early 2021, and we've spoken to her a couple of times since then. She told us this past year has been the most difficult for Jane Doe, and those challenges continue. And to be honest, Hightower told Joe Paris, it's a tough topic to talk about, and she feels the trauma too, just helping Jane Doe get through it.
It's been difficult. I mean, I think along the way, there are people who have touched this matter, who have been impacted by sexual violence in their past, or who have reached out in support for Jane Doe, who have been touched by sexual violence in their past. And to hear those stories is both, I feel grateful that people are sharing those, and it's also really difficult to know how many people are impacted day in, day out.
One of the big storylines through this whole, I guess, last year is the public doxing of a rape victim, something that I think was shocking to many in this community. Now that we've had time to kind of watch this play out, I guess, what are your thoughts on the last year in terms of an active campaign to diminish the, I guess, the story and position of a victim?
I have a lot of things going through my head right now. I can tell you I am angry, and I sit with that anger every day that that was allowed to happen, that people made that choice. As a society, we put so much pressure on victims of sexual assault to report because it's the right thing to do, and often part of that is that you have a responsibility to protect future victims, which first of all isn't fair. No one who's been harmed should have the responsibility of preventing future harm. But that's kind of the narrative that gets pushed out. You cannot expect people to ever talk about sexual violence if they're gonna receive the treatment that Jane Doe received through this case. Yeah. I'm just so angry at it. Yeah.
And as we saw notably, Jane Doe tried to testify, and she was clearly traumatized and overwhelmed in the courtroom and had to leave. How difficult was that for you to watch?
That was a really hard moment. It had been a pretty tense few hours leading up to that. I mean, this is one area that I'd like to address, and speaking to you right now is a good place to do it. One of the things that I know with my client that was really scary was that she was going to have to talk about really intimate details of her life in front of people. And given who was involved in this, there was a lot of media present in that room that day. There were people there supporting her that day. There were people there supporting him that day. But what that led to was a courtroom full of people that she did not know. And she doesn't know who's there for her and who's there not for her. So that was hard. That was hard for me. It was hard watching that because you could see the pain she was in the moment.
As a legal expert, as someone who's an advocate, what do you do in this situation? Is this just the way it is? Or there are ways to protect victims of violence like this so they don't have to be traumatized in court just to get their story on the record?
Yeah. And so this is where it's not black or white. It's not an easy choice to make. That prosecution team was prepared. They set a blueprint for how you prosecute cases without having a victim. And I give them so many kudos and commend them for that. They were prepared for whatever choice she made. But when you have been assaulted, you don't know what the right decision is. There's many people absolutely feel the need to show up and tell their story and talk about what happened to them. And many people don't want to do that. And some people don't know what they want to do. And so it's hard to say one way or the other, she shouldn't have been in that position. But it needs to be led by the person who has been harmed, and that's the person who's been assaulted.
But a guilty verdict last week doesn't all of a sudden make the trauma go away for Jane Doe or anyone that's been like her.
Right, and I think that's a really good point for people who haven't experienced sexual violence to recognize, because if you've never experienced it, if you've never been through these systems, you think, okay, if that happened to me, I'd report to law enforcement, it would get prosecuted, the person would get found guilty, and there will be justice served. A guilty verdict is not justice. It does not heal. It does not fix what happened to my client. Or anyone who has been sexually assaulted. What it does is at least, it shows that 12 people believe me, that this happened to me. And that's something, but it's certainly not a magic bullet. It's not going to fix everything. I mean, I hope that people can see how hard this is for folks who experience sexual violence and recognize why they make the choices they do, such as not reporting or seeking alternative means of healing. And that for those who do want to report, that we're listening to or watching and figuring out, how can we make these systems better? How can we make them smoother? How can we better advocate for the needs of people who experience sexual violence? I don't know what that looks like, and it's going to involve a team, but there needs to be people from different perspectives coming in and figuring out some solutions.
Joe, that was a powerful interview right there. And I'm going to get to the comfort level of that in just a second, but I wanted to ask you what Annie had to say about the media and how we could have done something differently with this.
Well, it was a candid conversation I had with Annie. You remember last year, Brian, and the audience may remember, there was a situation where we used audio from Jane Doe's testimony in a house, and we ended up realizing that we made a mistake, and we apologized for that. And it really made us look back and think, how do we cover situations like this that are very sensitive? And as Annie and I spoke this afternoon, we don't know what the answer is, Brian, but I think it's great that we're having conversations and continue to look for answers on things like, how does the media handle this? How can a court handle this so that a victim doesn't have to be re-traumatized? And, there's a lot of media attention on something like this. As she mentioned, there was 2-3 reporters from several different outlets. All of a sudden, you have 30 members of the media. It's very difficult.
Annie was obviously not in the most comfortable position speaking, sitting on her hands, kind of, you can see the emotion and hear it, obviously. How has this affected her?
It's been hard. It's been very hard for her, and she was very candid with me this afternoon. It's something that she doesn't know if she's going to be able to continue doing, because it's not just this Jane Doe. There's so many Jane Does out there, and most of them we'll never hear about. But working through something like this and going through the trauma with Jane and seeing her being chased out of the state capitol, being doxxed, being harassed, people trying to figure out where she lived, it takes a toll on someone like Annie. And when we sit here and talk with her, you could tell she was uncomfortable talking about this, but we appreciate her for doing it, because these are very important conversations we need to have.
And we want you to draw attention to the number that's on the bottom of your screen now, because if you or you know somebody who has been a victim, a survivor of sexual violence, please use this number. There are people out there to help you, and they'd be more than happy to do it.
And we have full resources at ktvb.com for places like Faces of Hope Victim Center.
Thank you very much, Joe.
Yep.
It's dirty and dangerous work, and that danger turned deadly 50 years ago today in what is still considered the deadliest mine disaster in state history. We'll get to that piece of Idaho history after the break, but first, you see that number on your screen? Use it to join the 208 conversation. You can text us, or you can call us and leave a voicemail. Just talk to us, 208-321-5614. Don't forget to include your name and the hashtag the 208. In 1972, the Sunshine Silver Mine near Kellogg, Idaho, was considered the deepest and richest silver mine in the nation, according to the Spokesman Review that year. But on this day, the 2nd of May of that year, it also became the deadliest. The Sunshine Mine disaster left a huge hole in the tight-knit mining community and hundreds of families without fathers. A fire started, somehow, some 3,500 feet below surface, a place where no one thought it would or could. And it was burning undetected for hours near the air intake side of the mine where the fresh air was supposed to be coming in, which also helped fill the nearby tunnels with smoke and carbon monoxide. That toxic gas killed 91 miners by early afternoon. Diane Trecker works at the Shoshone County Mining and Smelting Museum in Kellogg. Her dad was working at the nearby Bunker Hill mine that day. This day, the 50th anniversary, Diane tells us how hard the tragedy hit the community.
You know, it's kind of like our 9/11 here in Kellogg. Everyone remembers where we were.
Diane Trecker remembers where she was on May 2nd, 1972.
I was in class that day. Yes, we were in class that day. I was a senior in high school at Kellogg High School that year.
That Tuesday morning, just after sunrise, 173 miners went to work at the Sunshine Mine.
Around 7 o'clock is when they entered into the jewel shaft.
Their entrance to one of the largest and deepest mines in the area, more than 100 miles of tunnels that reached more than a mile into the earth.
If they're working at the lower levels, say 5,200, 5,400, they had to go down the jewel 3,700 feet, then get on a train and go a mile back to the 10 shaft. Then from the 10 shaft, it was at 3,700, they'd hoist them down to the level they're working at.
A journey that would take some time.
Probably a half an hour. Or longer, at least a half an hour.
During that time, word was spreading about a smell of smoke reported by men leaving the night shift. However, a fire in a hard rock mine was virtually unheard of.
First of all, it's wet.
Yeah.
I mean, everything is wet. They have to pump water out all the time. Right around 11 o'clock, when the people were breaking for their lunch, the day shift was breaking for lunch, that is when they really started saying, we can't ignore this. And by 11:30 was when it was finally reported, or it was finally reported to the foreman's office. Smoke was so thick at that point, and it was starting to affect people at that point. They were starting to fall.
They were collapsing from the carbon monoxide filling the tunnels.
Monoxide, is odorless. And they found a lot of the people on 46, 48, 52, 54, sitting with their lunch open, their sandwich out, a couple had their cup of coffee balanced on their knee, and they just died. They never knew what hit them.
By noon, the foreman at the 3,700 level declared an evacuation.
It took a full 26 minutes for it to reach some of the men. And by the time it reached some of the men in the lower levels of the mine, the hoist was already out of operation because the hoistman had died. And there was no one there to operate the hoist to bring them out.
Despite desperate attempts to use alternate escape routes, only 80 miners made it to the surface.
So 93 men were still trapped underground at the end of that day.
While a vigil formed above, rescue teams in small capsules were sent in to find the others. Little did they know, only 2 of them were still alive. Tom Wilkinson and Ron Flory were 4,800 feet below the surface. They'd found a storage room that happened to have a source of fresh air and water. They survived 7 days on their lunches and those of their dead coworkers. Tom and Ron walked out on May 9th and spent that night in the hospital.
The next morning, they were served top sirloin steak and a beer and went home that afternoon.
They were the lucky ones. 91 others were not. To this day, the Sunshine Mine disaster remains the deadliest mining accident in Idaho history.
And it affected everybody in this community.
Governor Cecil Andrus showed up the next day to join the families in standing vigil for hours and the days following. President Richard Nixon asked the Federal Bureau of Mines to investigate, and it soon became known many of the miners were unprepared for such an event, almost all of them. According to Diane, there hadn't been a lot of training for the men on how to use the self-resuscitators they had down in the mines, and that would have saved their lives. Bob Bush's dad, Robert Warren Bush, was working in the Sunshine Mine that day. Bob was just 23, just married, just graduated from the University of Idaho, and living in Arizona at the time, coaching a Little League softball team when he got the news about his dad. Well, Bob returned to Kellogg this morning for the 50th anniversary ceremony with Governor Little in attendance. And Bob told us about the impact the disaster had on him and the industry.
My dad was the underground production foreman, and he was on the 3,700 foot level. I know that he had gone from 10 shaft headed to jewel shaft, which is right close to where the smoke intake was coming from upper workings. My guess is that's almost exactly where he died. And I grew up by the mine, so I knew virtually everybody. And I was a cager, which is basically an elevator that goes between the levels, delivering the men to their working levels. So yeah, I knew a lot of them, and it was pretty tragic when it happened, obviously. I had 6 of my classmates in my high school class at Kellogg High School that didn't make it out. So yeah, it wasn't easy at first, and I'm getting used to it now.
I had a woman describe it to me today as Kellogg's 9/11. Everybody remembers where they were that day.
Yeah, and that came up a lot today in the ceremony, particularly how the mine safety has been improved because of the accident. And I believe that's probably true around the world because, I worked for a mining company my last 10 years before I retired, and everywhere that anybody knew anything about Sunshine, it was always about how much its safety had improved.
Now, Bob worked his summers and winter break while attending the U of I in that mine, as he said, running people up and down the mine shaft. Despite that investigation issued by President Richard Nixon, they never found the cause of the fire because it basically destroyed everything in that space. In 1974, the Idaho legislature approved funds to build a memorial on the site. Today, a 13-foot tall metal miner with a glowing headlamp with 91 miniature tombstones stands guard nearby. In this past legislative session, lawmakers in the House passed a Miners Memorial Day resolution, meaning every year on May 2nd, they will commemorate the contributions and sacrifice of miners throughout Idaho history and the 50th anniversary of the Sunshine Mine fire. Strong winds in your forecast for tomorrow. Just about a month ago, high winds took out one of the most historic and recognizable spots in eastern Idaho, the Spud Drive-in in Driggs. You know, it's nestled up against the Wyoming border. Tetons is the backdrop. Can't beat the view day or night. Well, I should say couldn't beat the view because winds, as we said, some as strong as 55 miles an hour, destroyed the 70-year-old 70-foot screen. Those are pictures of it there. Yeah, it was built in 1953, listed on the National Register of Historic Places. In its decades-long history, it has withstood hundreds of windstorms, thunderstorms, other natural disasters, but that single storm took it down. And at the time, the managers of the Spud Drive-in told us not to worry. They had insurance, they'd be up and running in time for the summer season. Well, we learned today that unfortunately won't be the case. In an announcement on their Facebook page this morning, the Spud Drive-in says, due to the supply and demand of building material and advancing our 70-year-old blueprints to 2020's standards, we will not be opening this summer. And that's sad. Unfortunately, it hit one of the most popular tourist destinations just in time to cancel its season. It wasn't even because of COVID this time around. They say they promise to throw one of the greatest parties the Teton Valley has ever seen when they do reopen in 2023. All right, lots of comments today about our interview with Annie Hightower, Jane Doe's attorney through the rape investigation and the trial last week that saw Aaron Von Ellinger convicted of rape. A lot of people talking about the process that needs to change. My mom was assaulted in the early 1990s. She focused on being a survivor, and she talked at many post academies. These women need our support, not words of negativity, says Kelly. Thank you for sharing that. I understand the trauma Jane Doe went through. It's real and it's tragic. I was raped in the early 90s and couldn't talk about it until 2021, when we were all locked down with COVID and forced to be around family and friends. Men have no idea how they destroy women's lives just because they think they are entitled to whatever, says Jerry. Brian, I understand her attorney and I understand why Jane Doe walked out on the trial. When I had to testify against my attacker, I walked out also. Took me 3 times to face him. I was looking at a monster, the same monster that sexually assaulted me. This is 45 years later and I still have nightmares. I worked for 8 years as a sexual assault intervention specialist with victims of sexual assault. It helped, but I'm a survivor, not a victim, says Kathy from Star. And thank you for sharing those stories with us. My jaw hit the ground when I heard you mention that people actually tried to find out where Jane Doe lived. Perhaps I'm naive, but how can people be so cold and callous to another's pain, asked Dale. Well, Dale, reminds me of a phrase that was brought up in the last recent years, something about your feelings. That's kind of taken a lot of people, well, kind of directed their actions lately, unfortunately.